Hello. I wanted to make a few videos coming back to my first synthesizer and reflect on what I loved about it, what I still love about it, and also how my approach to synthesis has changed since then, and to maybe bring back to this synthesizer some of the new perspectives that I have. If you follow my channel, you'll know that most of my videos right now are about chaotic noise making instruments, and particularly a focus on the no input mixing board as a feedback instrument. And so one might not think that the Moog Mavis has a lot of connection to the sort of noise and chaos that is my day-to-day instrument that I'm working with. But I see a really clear through line between this thing that I started out with and a lot of the material that I'm working with now. And so I thought it would be really nice to both trace that line back to the Mavis and also to revisit the Mavis with that new perspective, that sort of noise and chaos focused perspective, to bring forward some of the more chaotic elements that are present in the Mavis and showcase how I would take my current approach back to my first synthesizer. And I'm going to make a few videos on this topic, but for this first one, I wanted to start simply by explaining why I like this thing and the effect that I think it's had on the way that I approach synthesis. I'll share some recreations of what I remember as my favorite patches from when I was starting out, and then I want to catalog some of my favorite features about this device. From there, I'm going to talk a little bit about its influence on me and some of the conclusions that I've come to thinking about this thing a few years on. After this video, my plan is to make a follow-up video, which is bringing my current noise approach back to the Mavis. And then I want to finish off with a third video in the series that gives some advice and perspective on how one might make all sorts of different kinds of music with the Moog Mavis, to think broadly about it as a platform for synthesis. The type of video that I think I would have really enjoyed when I was starting out with this thing. So this is the Moog Mavis. It's a monophonic analog synthesizer voice, but it's also, I think, a solid platform for synthesis more broadly. It's a miniature palette or easel of sound that invites you into all of the possibilities of synthesis. I think that the Mavis is open to a broad variety of sound worlds and characters, and not all of them are serious in the way that one might think about serious synthesizers. I think that there's a playfulness that's possible with the broad sound worlds of this thing. And that playfulness, I think, is really important for sound design. It's both a source of joy that keeps you nourished as you're exploring synthesizers and exploring sound design possibilities, but it's also a method to develop new techniques through playfulness. You can achieve sounds by taking a very serious, intentional approach to create a sound, but you can also achieve really delightful new sounds through curiosity and playfulness and exploring and pushing on the boundaries of delight in a synthesizer. When I was first starting out with the Mavis, I would find a lot of patches that made me laugh, that I would share with friends and say, look how silly this can be. Look how unexpected and delightful. And so the patches and configurations that I'm going to share today are an attempt to recreate some of my favorite results from that playful exploration that I was first doing when I got the Mavis. Let's make some sound. A small amount of vibrato. Some resonance, enveloped. There. little bit of glide. When I was first starting out, this sort of cartoonish cat was one of my favorite patches. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think one of the things that I love about it, beyond it just being quite cute, is that it shows off so many of the principles of synthesis and how you take the basic elements of a subtractive synthesis patch and connect them together. It has vibrato, it has filter modulation, it has a really interesting relationship between the pitch and the cutoff in order to sort of open and then close almost to a point where the cutoff sinks down below the pitch of the oscillator. You can hear all of these mechanics acting in this patch. But then it also makes me think of little cartoon characters. It makes me think of Summer Camp Island and some of the really cute sounds that exist in that TV show. And I don't know, it makes me think of a character. It makes me imagine a particular entity, this weird little cartoon cat. And I love that. Another thing that I found early on with the Moog Mavis, because it makes it so easy to make these sorts of patches, is that FM synthesis is really cool. I love how quickly it's right around 1 o'clock here on the LFO rate that we get up into audio rate, and we really can take it all the way up into a high audio rate. And that range that from very slow up into the audio rate became something that I really fell in love with. One of the things I love about these sorts of FM patches is that there are so many different sounds that are possible, and you have to really seek through them all by ear, looking at the relationship between the pitch of your carrier, the pitch of your modulator, and the depth of modulation. So that's a lovely. And then being able to just throw in a little bit of the envelope generator alongside of there to really just push that around. It makes it so easy to get to all of these really complex FM sounds. And with a simple patch of the keyboard output to the LFO rate, because the LFO tracks volt per octave, it means that we can get a fairly consistent sound here that tracks pitch very nicely. Without that, the LFO maintains a flat rate against the changing VCO. and it's not nearly as tonal. And so I think by making these sorts of things easy, the Mavis really teaches you how to approach things like FM synthesis just by the openness of its interface. I love these sounds. Another thing that really amazed me with the Mavis when I was first starting out was the variety of percussion sounds that it could produce. I love the really snare-like sounds that you can get with a snappy envelope and some wide-ranging FM on the Mavis. They're really cool. And because with the keyboard scale, you can push the range on the keyboard to something that's much more playfully CV oriented than rooted in notions of semitones and scales. You can get a wide range of percussion out of a single configuration or patch. Now, if I decouple the LFO and the pitch, then this divergence in CV values can mean something else. Just lots of weird percussion that you can get with this. And the fluidity of the modulation, the way that you're blending sort of like amounts and also between the envelope and the LFO, encourages you to just listen and explore through listening, to fine tune things to exactly the right spot. There's something that always amazed me about just how many different characters of sound were possible in the Mavis. Like, I don't think that monophonic analog synthesizer voice really describes the way that I feel about this thing. It's much, much broader. And with these patches that I've been showing so far, I haven't even really been patching anything. And I think that's in part because when I was starting out, I didn't understand what the total potential of the patch bay was for. But that's something that I love so much about the Mavis, is that the setup of its different components already invite unpredictability and fluidity in patching just by the way that things are normaled together. So cats and bells and drums and all sorts of strange in between things on those sounds. But there's one more character category of sound that I really like, and that's the one that I was noodling on for my prelude to this first video, and that's flute sounds. I love how soft and pretty the Mavis can sound like this. And a lot of it's coming from the just a little bit of pulse width modulation, this lovely blend between a square and a saw, a low cutoff, all of these things that, like when I think of square waves, I don't think of, I think of square waves as being harsh, fuzzy, full of harmonic content. And the filter is doing so much work to tone that down in a lovely way. But I think even just the pulse width modulation is doing stuff too. It's very video game harmonica, uh, which is also a fun sound. It has so much air in it. It breathes so much with the pulse width modulation. It's very wistful. Yeah, the best way I can describe it is just being full of air or breath, even more than air. It feels like it's coming from inside somewhere. Coming back to this little collection of patches has been a really lovely way to help me reflect on what I really like about this synthesizer. And in trying to engage more deeply with that love that I have for this thing, I've come to realize that some of my favorite features about this device, there are some things that I think make this really unique. And there may be things that are different than what other people talk about when they say what makes the Mavis unique. The first thing that I really love about the Mavis is just how many things are organized through crossfaders on it. The VCO and VCF mod mixes blend smoothly between the envelope generator and the LFO. The VCO waveform and the VCO and the LFO waveforms also smoothly blend. On one end of the VCO, you have a saw, on the other end, a pulse. And in between, you have things that lack names but have a clear difference in their sound as you blend from one to the other. And that fluidity of possibility invites so many little opportunities to fine tune the sound that you're getting out of this thing. I realize just how uncommon it feels like crossfaders like this are uh, on many other synthesizers. And of course, you can set them up, but it's a idiom or way of patching that I really appreciate the Mavis bringing forward, because it's something that I think about a lot now that I'm going to other synthesizers as well and saying, oh, I wish I could create a blend of two things, because that's how it was when I started. The second thing that I really love about this is this keyboard scale. First, the inclusion of a keyboard generally makes the Mavis so playable and so open to exploration. But then combining that with this keyboard scale here really makes this more than a keyboard. It makes it a touch interface for any sort of CV application. It encourages an engagement with tonality by saying, here's a keyboard. You can play traditional tonal music on the Mavis without needing any other equipment. But it's also a way to break out of tonality by expanding that to a massive range that you can jump between any way that you like. I really just want to recognize the palette of utilities that the Mavis provides. The independent attenuator to say, take anything and attenuate it, or the inclusion of the sample and hold here, which I absolutely love, especially because the sample and hold works off of the VCO and not a noise source. It creates a really complex, interesting generator of values out of the sample and hold that really prepared me for some of the ideas that I encountered later on regarding sample and holds and chaos in synthesis. The wide-ranging parameters that the LFO so readily steps up into the audio rate, that the VCO so readily gets to the bottom of audio rate and then can be pushed lower with a negative voltage that you can get from the utilities on here. This really broke down some of the barriers in my thinking when I was first approaching synthesis of what a VCO is, what an LFO is, of realizing just the total range of frequency and what the consequences of that can be for creating complex sounds. What I mean to be getting at here is that if you take the Mavis as a package for synthesis, as a miniature easel or palette for making all sorts of sounds, and you take that as an answer to the question of what is synthesis for someone who's coming into synthesizers and electronic music for the first time, I love the answer that the Mavis gives to that question. I love the tools that it gives you, the way that it connects those tools together, and the way that that creates a statement for saying this is a full introduction to what synthesis can be. I think that one's entry point into synthesis ends up creating a really sticky sense of what's normal or to be expected on a synthesizer. And in this way, the norms of synthesis presented by the Mavis are, while in many ways still rooted in the Moog idioms of subtractive East Coast synthesizer, are actually, I think, quite unique. There are connections to the West Coast idioms, not only with the wave folder, which to me is honestly one of the less interesting parts of the Mavis, but these West Coast idioms I think are actually much deeper, with the sort of cross-fading timbral control and the flexible keyboard interface, which feels very Buchla-esque to me now. And then there are also connections to what I associate with Rob Hordijk's approach to synthesis, sometimes called Dutch West Coast, with the sample and hold and the normalizing of that to the VCO. My point here is to show that there are all of these different idioms, and they're perhaps more fluidly connected than we might think when we think of East Coast, West Coast, other things entirely. The Mavis presents something that dips into all of these in a very fluid way and blends between them. And that unique palette for synthesis isn't particularly interested in these distinctions. As a first synthesizer, I think it prepared me very well to move fluidly across these conceptual borders in synthesis. All of this is to say that I really like the Moog Mavis, and I'm really happy that it was my first synthesizer. I think that there's so much about it that invites a generous, broad view into synthesis, and I really benefited from that when I was starting out. Reflecting on this, it's gotten me to think about synthesis as an invitation to a variety of worlds. That the sound palette that the Mavis presents is so flexible and can be so many things, but in all of these things that it can be, I think there's a way to look at the synthesizer as a sound palette to be a device for writing fiction, for creating characters and creating environments where little cat cartoon creatures and flutes and drums and bells and all of these things can be not only synthesized, but also imagined through synthesis. And I think there's something really beautiful in that in an open synthesis platform as an invitation to a variety of worlds. I think the Mavis really gets at that breadth that modular does so well. But I think that even outside of modular, the whole act of synthesis as the act of invention and fiction can make this a really beautiful writing device. But even to put that completely aside, I think there's another view that looks at the synthesizer as an entry point or a magnifying glass for the beauty of sound itself, to cast aside all of these imagined creatures and places and instead listen to abstract sound, to break apart the cartoonish cat into all of its components and see how they fit together creates an appreciation for all of these individual features that collide together to become a sound. And that beauty of abstractness is also equally present in an open platform like the Mavis. And I think that's where I'm going to continue in my next video. In approaching the Mavis as a sound and noise generator with my current perspectives, I really want to showcase the beauty and creativity of sound that's possible on this thing. So I'll see you next time for another video on the Mavis. And if you have any questions, feel free to write in the comments, let me know what you think. And more importantly, I hope you take this as an invitation to revisit your earlier synthesizers, to go back to, even if you don't have them anymore, to go back to the way that you approached synthesis when you were first coming to it, and find the things that you thought were beautiful then, because there are probably really interesting ideas buried in those feelings, and it's worth reinvestigating them.